Welcome back to the Bible in Context.
Where context is king and the original author's intent drives our interpretation.
So, last time in chapter 48, we took a long detour on Israel and some different theology. So, can you recap, what did we learn in chapter 48? Don't go into all the Israel stuff.
I was going to say, you want me to recap
don't
the
do
tangent that we went on? No, 48 was all about Jacob blessing Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's two children. And so we get a whole chapter on just those two blessings. We talked about the angel of the Lord kind of pops in there in the blessing. And I think that chapter really shows us just the significance of Joseph in the story, that Jacob literally adopts his grandkids to have the same inheritance as his own kids.
Right. And who's the firstborn now?
Oh yeah, and so there's this big deal where Manasseh was biologically the firstborn, but Ephraim is the one that gets the firstborn blessing.
Right. And I haven't read this yet. We're going to in this episode, but Chronicles interprets this story the same way, where Joseph, he gets the firstborn blessing, which then passes on to Ephraim.
Right.
So we'll get there when we get to the blessing of Joseph. One more thing to say real quick. Do you want to sum up for us, how do we take these blessings? How are we supposed to read them?
Yeah, these blessings are meant to really capture what these different tribes are going to be experiencing while they're in the promised land.
Right. This is very broad strokes.
Very broad, very vague, meant to be a little bit loose too, I think.
Yeah, they are.
There'll be some twists and some turns, and what we talked about last week, God has a dynamic relationship with humanity, and so these are intentionally vague,
right?
So that there's room for humanity to be humans.
Right. And we also talk about just, how do you preach this kind of stuff in the last episode a little bit. So go check that out if you haven't and you're wondering that, because we're not going to rehash all that. But yeah, this applies to Israel in the land between their entry into the land and the conquest up to the time of the exile. And it's meant to be essentially, you look at if Israel, they're sitting there, they've just come out of the exile and they read these blessings and they're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I think, last time I used the example of, what did I say the Kentucky blessing would be? That
running around barefoot, drinking bourbon.
Exactly. Like, that makes sense. You, Kentucky, shall be running through the hills barefoot with bourbon in your glass. Like,
right.
That's right. Yeah, that sounds like us.
Yep.
So,
well,
you're not from
you.
here. Yeah, you're not from
I'm not from Kentucky.
That's how I spend my spare time. Okay.
I've been down here long enough.
Yeah. Yeah, what's it been, like a decade?
2 decades.
20.
How old's Hannah? Hannah's 22. So 22 years.
You belong here. You're one of us now.
Almost half my life now.
Yeah, okay. You're one of us now.
Yeah.
So, okay. Officially a redneck. All right. Let's see.
All right, so we're jumping into chapter 49 where we get the rest of Jacob's blessings to his sons.
Yeah. And so again, we're not going to cover all of these. I just wanted to give you that lens through which to read all of these. We're going to hit on a few highlights, but again, we won't go through all of them because also commentators aren't really sure how exactly this applies. I think, if someone were in 3,000 years reading my little blessing on Kentucky, what in the world does that mean?
Right.
Like how, they may not know. And I don't think that we know everything going on in this passage, because some will point to the fact that the language in this passage seems very old. So this is probably a very old tradition, a very old blessing. And so it may have not been something that the author wrote down in order to link to other passages in Scripture necessarily, though we can see hints of it throughout the book of Judges to Kings. But also with that, we need to keep in mind that the author chose to preserve this, if he did preserve it and not just write it, in a way that ties into the rest of the story. And so it's meant to be read in context. It's meant to be here. If the author didn't want, or the editor, compiler, author didn't want it here, he wouldn't have put it here. So.
Right. And also the word blessing here, I think we're using it very loosely because not all of these are positive.
Right. A lot of scholars will refer to this as the testament of Jacob because, some of them are blessings, but it's, more so just broad strokes, characterizations of the tribes.
Yes.
And some future expectations based on Yahweh's promises thus far.
Yes. So we're not going to walk through every single one of these today, but we want to hit on some of the highlights.
Right.
So which ones do you want to hit on?
Oh, well, one more thing before I get into this is just also I just want to problematize the issue of relying on the language to determine when it was written. Because it could very well be that, yes, this has some older vocabulary, so this is an older text. It's original to, Jacob or Moses' time or somewhere in that era, even though Hebrew didn't actually exist in a written form at the time. Won't talk about that. But, if you watch the movie Patriot and they're all wearing colonial stuff and speaking colonial English and all this kind of stuff, do you assume, oh, they must have had, high definition cameras in 1776 or what, or is it like, okay, no, they know their history well enough to project their writing and storytelling and the effects back into that time. So maybe that's what happened. That happens in other places. I think Job is a good example. People assume that's the oldest book. It's probably one of the latest books, actually, even though the vocabulary has some older vocabulary in it.
So why don't we just say, there was an oral tradition that got passed down.
And that could be too.
Over the years,
yeah. That could be too. It may have just been that eventually the scribes wrote down the oral tradition and then that's what got put in here, or they just knew it, lots of possibilities. It's open-ended a little bit. So anyway, just wanted to problematize that.
I like the oral tradition idea.
Yeah, and that very well. It probably started there.
Yeah.
But
they probably had to fill in some gaps, I would assume.
Yeah, probably. And this may have been stylized to fit into this narrative too. But the whole point of this is just to say that don't try to read underneath and behind the text. Try to read the text in the context of the rest of the text.
So what you're saying is don't make assumptions.
Yeah. The person or the scribes, the group that put this all together meant for us to read it as a whole. And so don't try to take it out and dissect it. We've talked about that before. We talked about it with Carmen Imes, which you all haven't heard yet, but you will. So
Soon.
So let's dive in here. And so Jacob calls together his sons, and just going over this real quick, we'll see how far we can get. Reuben, he is the firstborn chronologically.
He's a putz.
He's a putz. And he's just screwed up over and over again. He took his father's wife. We saw how his character played out in the Joseph story. And so Jacob just, uses this opportunity to say, you're not getting the firstborn blessing.
You're unstable as water.
Right. Yes. You're not leading this family.
Yeah.
And there you go. There's Reuben. Short and sweet.
Yeah. Well, and he specifically mentions that you defiled his bed.
Right. This is in Genesis 35, by the way.
Yes. Yeah. You can go back to that story.
Yeah.
He went up to my couch, and back in chapter 35, it's like one verse.
Right.
That's all you get, but it obviously was a bigger deal. It was a big deal.
Yeah. we talked about it in that episode. This happened with Ham and Noah and Noah's wife. This happens with, I think it's Abimelech in 2 Samuel 16, where he does this to all of David's wives. It's a way to claim power by taking your father's wife to say, I'm now the head of the family.
You're marking your territory.
In this culture. So that's what Reuben was doing. He was trying to obtain the firstborn blessing continually throughout his story, and he continued to fail because he did it in a way that was taking power for honor rather than being honorable and earning it like Judah did. So Simeon and Levi, they were the ones that went to the rescue of their full sister Dinah in Shechem, and they slaughtered everybody. And so because of that, Jacob says, I'm going to divide you in Israel. This takes place in different ways. We just talked about how the blessings don't have to play out according to the original means of the text, because it seems like, okay, that means that they're going to no longer be a tribe at some point. Levi gets scattered by becoming God's priests and temple servants. And so that may be the way we're supposed to read this. Maybe. We're not told, so it's kind of vague.
It's meant to be vague, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
But if you're living in the land and you know that Levi's tribe doesn't have a land or a spot of their own, this kind of makes sense.
Right. That's probably the natural way you're going to take it. So
right.
That's the way that most scholars will take it as well. So it makes sense. If we could be wrong, but that's the standard interpretation, and it kind of just fits because we're just not told. It's kind of vague. Simeon, on the other hand, we don't know entirely. His tribe was kind of enveloped by Judah because it was so small. In the book of Numbers, there's a rebellion that happens with Simeon, and so they go from being a tribe of 59,000 people down to 22,000 people by the end of the book of Numbers, and so they shrink quite a bit. That could be what it's referring to, maybe not. Also, Simeon's not mentioned among the tribes in the blessing in Deuteronomy 33 with Moses. Also not mentioned in Judges 5 and Deborah's song. So they lose some status. Maybe that's what we're supposed to be seeing as we go through these stories. Again, maybe it refers to something different. So let's go to Judah, and this is one we want to pause on for a minute. Now, the first line here in verse 8, Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down to you.
Who else has heard that?
Right. This sounds really familiar. This was the same thing that Joseph was told and had happened to him.
Right.
And From Prisoner to Prince by Sam Amati points this out, where it seems like starting here, the life of Joseph, the blessings and the messianic profile that Joseph builds, or that is built through Joseph, is being transferred over to Judah. And that'll become more clear in just a second, because we have the kingly status that he represented in his messianic role now transferring onto Judah. And so, yeah, we're told as we go on that he's a conqueror of his enemies. That's, again, Abrahamic language. You're going to possess the gates of your enemies and so on, that you see throughout Genesis. The scepter shall not depart from Judah in verse 10, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until tribute comes to him. So he's going to rule the nations, give tribute to him. I think that translation is correct. And yeah, to him shall be the obedience of the people. So that same thrust of the obedience of the people in that tribute line. And then the next part, so it goes from kingship and ruling over the nations and brothers and being a conqueror in verses 8 through 10 to verses 11 through 12, where it talks about his abundance and his honor, physical beauty in verse 12. In verse 11, it says, binding his foals with the vine. You don't put your donkeys on a vine because they're going to eat your crops. They're going to eat your grapes. So this is like just abundant richness everywhere. So you're so rich that you don't care if in this culture, your donkey sits there and eats your money, basically, eats your food. And this is in a culture where you have a hungry season,
right?
Too.
Right.
So yeah, and the donkey's colt to a choice vine, and he has washed his garments in wine, his vestures in the blood of grapes. Now here, I just want to point out two things. The donkey's colt to the choice vine. So here we have an association between Judah and the donkey and the foal and the donkey's colt. We have, or I think this might begin the typological thread of the Davidic king being associated with a donkey, because we have Solomon being inaugurated by riding his father David's donkey, which then Zechariah, we talked about this in the prophecy episode, Zechariah picks this up to depict the coming Davidic king. So again, go listen to the prophecy episode. I think this could be the start of that typological thread, that association between the royal Judahite king and a donkey. We also have the idea that he has washed his garments in wine and his vestures in the blood of grapes. This might just be a note about the richness of his kingdom, and that might be all that it is. But I find it interesting that it talks about garments being washed in wine and the blood of grapes. Who else in this story has had their garments washed in blood?
It would be Joseph.
Right. Whenever they tried to sell him out, he began his exodus, or his exile, before going through Exodus and all this. So again, I think this is possibly applying that two goats motif to Judah's future king as well, being that one who bears the sins of Israel and works to cleanse them in some way.
When it says his eyes are darker than wine and his teeth whiter than milk, is that a good thing?
Yeah, this is a statement of like his physical beauty.
Okay.
Often kings are portrayed as like tall and beautiful people, handsome in stature, things like that. And so it's just saying like he's a very wealthy and honorable. He's just a kingly figure. So yeah, I think this might be applying the two goats motif through the associations with Joseph, or through the associations and repetition with Joseph, potentially, to portray the future Judahite king as one who's going to bear Israel's sins and also make cleansing so that they can dwell with Yahweh. So I think that's applied to Judah through this. It may not be, because it may also just be saying like wine is so abundant that you wash your clothes in it. You're super rich and wealthy and fruitful through his reign.
Yeah, I think that's probably like it's an abundance of wealth.
And then, yeah, it finishes out here in verse 12 with just statements about his kingly beauty, which was kind of typical of kings in this culture. It's what you want to look for. They're kind of blessed by the gods in this way. In this case, blessed by God. So again, through this blessing, we have the messianic picture that Joseph portrays through his story being transferred onto the Davidic king. This is actually looking forward to David, the first Davidic king. But, that story doesn't go well. The Davidic lineage does not do well. Israel doesn't do well. So they all get exiled. And then Jesus picks up that mantle that is discussed here later down the road. And that's how this gets the intention behind it stays true while the means seems to fluctuate. But any other comments or thoughts on Judah's blessing?
Did we already discuss 1 Chronicles 5?
No, I did mention that.
Yeah, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so read 1 Chronicles 5, 1 through 2.
The sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, for he was the firstborn, but because he defiled his father's couch, his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph, the sons of Israel, so that he could not be enrolled as the oldest son. Though Judah became strong among his brothers, and a chief came from him, yet the birthright belonged to Joseph.
Yep. So Chronicles is reading this in the same way that we are, that the king was supposed to come from Judah, but Joseph was to be the firstborn within that generation. And that's going to transfer. So we see this actually take place in Psalm 78, 67 through 68, where it says, "He, being God, rejected the tent of Joseph. He did not choose the tribe of Ephraim, but he chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loves." And so in this psalm, and from the expectations in Genesis 49 and what the chronicler is seeing, is Joseph was the firstborn. The rule was given to Judah, and so that firstborn status, which is also leadership, passed to Judah and to the Davidic king later in Israel's history. For a while, Joseph was the firstborn, and then it switched.
Gotcha.
So that's all. And that's important too, just to recognize that these are not like, a lot of people will read these and say these are supposed to be static truths throughout all generations.
Right.
That's not how it works. Things can change, and just because God says something doesn't mean that he doesn't reserve the right to change the way that he does what he says.
Right. Yeah. He's going to accomplish his purposes. He doesn't always have to do it the same way.
And he can also make plans to change what he said later. Like, he doesn't have to be this static bubble that, can do one thing in the world and that thing remains that way throughout the rest of time. Yeah. And I think that's just a confusion that we often
and I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where like his goals never change, and he's going to accomplish those goals.
Right, and he has the power to do it and the wisdom to do it.
Yeah, but the way that he does it is very dynamic, and it can change and shift in light of circumstances.
Exactly, yeah. Kind of like the bag of chips example. Like, my intention to go to Kroger. God has said, I'm going to get you a bag of chips, and I intend to go to Kroger, but things don't work out, and I end up at Lowe's or whatever. I grab a bag there off the whatever. But God accomplished it.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's probably a really dumb example, but whatever. Oh, and I want to say one more thing about this. The word rovates, which is, let's see, I think it shows up twice. Let me check. In verse 9, where it says that he crouched as a lion. This is that word that we saw back in Genesis 4 to talk about the crouching demon, or the lying down sin offering. Now, people will use this verse in particular to say, look, no, that word rovates, it's a hostile word. It's a word of being on the prowl. But read the context. So, from the prey, my son, you have gone up. You have stooped down and crouched as a lion, as a lioness. Who dares rouse him? So this is painting a picture of Judah as a conqueror who has already conquered. He goes up from the prey. He is done. He is resting. Who dares to rouse him now that he is resting? So it's not saying he crouches as a lion. He's resting.
He's not
like
ready to pounce. He's relaxed.
Yeah, it's this picture of a fierce beast that is relaxing. You want to go mess with him?
Right. Don't poke the bear.
Right, exactly. So yeah, that's what's going on here. Rovates is a peaceful word. It shows up again in actually verse 14 with Issachar as a strong donkey crouching between the sheepfolds. Again, he's not prowling. He's lowering himself for service. But okay, so after this, we get into, we have Zebulun, then Issachar, then Dan, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, and we're going to just sweep over those. If you want some technical resources where you can go just read about how these blessings may have been working out in the kingdom period or the judges period, you can go pick up really any good commentary. I think Waldke in his commentary talks about it. You got Sarna has some really good discussion, and Nikot, Word Biblical Commentary. Just go pick up a commentary and they'll give you some discussion on that. So we're not going to hash all that well-trodden territory. All right, so Joseph. This passage about Joseph, 22 through 26, contains some, especially 22 through 24, contains several textual issues that commentators still really haven't reached a consensus on. And so we won't dive too deep into those, but most translations read like the ESV, where Joseph is a fruitful bough. It is vine imagery, where Joseph is a vine. But that word isn't so clear. Word Biblical Commentary will detail how these translation issues have come about and the different thoughts on them. So I would go pick up Word Biblical Commentary on this passage to really get the details there. But I just want to discuss a couple of the differences. So, for instance, in verse 22, scholarship is in consensus, it seems like, about the generalities of the translation. Joseph is not a fruitful bough, but he is a wild donkey. The consensus is that this is donkey language, animal language, where it says Joseph is a donkey, a wild donkey beside a spring. He is a wild colt beside the wall. That's what scholarship has kind of reached a consensus on. And in verse 24, there's some more ambiguity, where it says that his bow remained unmoved in the ESV and his arms were made agile by the hand of the mighty one of Jacob. It's not really clear whose bow was actually being held and whose arms were made steady. So it could be that Joseph was the archer in the situation, or what I think makes more sense, and it seems most scholars lean towards, is the enemies were the archers. Nicot actually has that the archer's bow was broken by God. And again, there's some ambiguity in those words. It's hard to know, like, was the enemy's bow strengthened against Joseph, but Joseph still prevailed through God? Or was the enemy's bow broken by God so that Joseph could prevail? We don't really know exactly, but the point is that Jacob is described as having been oppressed, but then helped and blessed by God. And we see this in his being sold, in his being falsely accused and forgotten. Maybe the wild donkey aspect is supposed to kind of refer to his lording his dreams over his brothers, his arrogance there, and also maybe his future taking up of headship over Judah as he separates from Jerusalem and becomes the northern nation of Israel. Again, a lot of these are vague, but that's kind of where I would lean with that. It's maybe describing those two realities about Joseph and the northern kingdom. So I think that's how to take the beginning part of this blessing. Now, there's some interesting things going on as we go on from there. Joseph has been rescued by God out of his trials, and even in the future, Ephraim, he's going to become a multitude of nations and be rescued out of the nations, which is, again, a flipping of the original intention of chapter 48. But even still, Joseph's future children will be rescued by God, despite their arrogance. So maybe that's pointing towards this a little bit. At least the original readers who are sitting just after the exile are still waiting for Israel to be regathered. And so there's this expectation that God will come through on his promises and rescue his lost people. So there's another issue just with verse 24, where it says, by the hand of the mighty one of Jacob, from there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. That's how the ESV reads. This line may be better understood as from there being the hands of the mighty one, the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Remember, the shepherd is a typical way to talk about a king in this culture. We also just saw it in chapter 48. I told you to hold on to the fact that Yahweh was called shepherd. This may be a way to talk about him. Also, the stone of Israel. The stone is kind of this motif throughout the Bible of Yahweh being a rock. But it can also just refer to refuge in general. So what this could be saying is it could be saying that the shepherd stone is coming from the hands of the mighty one. This could be a messianic passage, or it could refer to God as the shepherd who helped Joseph in this situation. He is the shepherd rock, depending on whether you say that from God's hand is the shepherd king, or you say that this is the shepherd king. There's some complication in the Hebrew there. So again, this could be a messianic passage. I think that David Mitchell has done a good job arguing that in his book, Messiah ben Joseph, but there hasn't been any, it seems like, strict consensus on this. And so this would be really cool if it is a messianic passage, but we don't really need it to be. Like, I don't hang my hat on it and say, like, this is what proves the Messiah. So if it's not a messianic passage, that's okay. I think there's a compelling case for it to be, but I don't put too much stock in it. So then it continues on after this, and verses 25 through 28, it says, the God of your father who will help you, by the mighty who will bless you, with the blessings of heaven above, the blessings of the deep that crouch beneath, blessings of the breast of the womb, the blessings of your father, and the mighty beyond the blessings of my parents, up to the bounties of the everlasting hills. May they be on the head of Joseph, on the brow of him who is set apart from his brothers. So Joseph gets blessing upon blessing upon blessing upon blessing upon blessing. So we're expecting like all these blessings that came to Abraham from Adam and Eve, from Noah, down to Jacob, and now are being passed through Jacob to Joseph onto Ephraim. So, I mean, it really seems like he's laying it on thick that Ephraim is going to be the firstborn.
Right.
So Because it struck me at first when I read this. When I've heard preaching on this chapter, it's always been on Judah's blessing, and you skip over everything else.
Yeah.
Then you read Joseph's blessing, like, what the heck? It seems like he got the good stuff.
Right.
And he kind of does, but it's going to transfer later. I also think it's interesting, and this, again, may be a point that this may not be an association the author is trying to make. It's interesting based on what we've already seen in the Joseph story. In chapter 26, the very last line is that the blessings are going to be on the brow of him who was set apart from his brothers. That word set apart is Nazir, which is the root of the word that we get Nazarite from, which we've already talked about how Joseph kind of consecrated himself as a Nazarite, it seems, through his shaving. So this could be a further association with him as set apart Lord. Nazir, yeah, it means set apart or devoted one. So again, just pointing to his devotedness to Yahweh, being set apart from his brothers by God to play this firstborn messianic silhouette role. That may not be what he's trying to say. It may just be a generic use of the word Nazir, but based on the previous associations of Joseph with the Nazarite vow and his devotedness to Yahweh, his being set apart by Yahweh, it's just interesting to see. And then we get Benjamin. Again, won't go into that one. It's pretty simple, straightforward. A lot of people don't know what to make of his blessing, but it may be something that Israel would have recognized that we don't today, and that's fine. So we finished out the blessings there, and we'll pick up at the very end of 49 next time and just finish out the rest of the book. And yeah, we'll be done with Genesis.
Coming to the end, man.
Yeah, and that was a confusing chapter, so I mean, any questions, send them in, put them on our Facebook page, whatever. There's a lot of deep rabbit holes you can go down with these blessings.